rest of the story. Jose de la Cueva had every advantage, every bright prospect in the world. His family was well-to-do. His home was in a fashionable neighborhood in Madrid. He attended the finest schools. Early on, he became an enthusiastic soccer player, and such a good one that in his teens he played for the Real Madrid soccer team, and sports writers said he had a brilliant future in that sport. But he had an even more promising future otherwise, for Jose was studying law in preparation for a career in the Spanish diplomatic service. His father, a prominent physician, was so proud. And then one day in the late summer of 1963, when Jose was almost 20, everything for which he had hoped vanished in a single awful moment. He'd been driving with friends on the outskirts of town when the car crashed. He was lucky to have survived, the doctor said, but beyond that, the prognosis was not encouraging. Among his many injuries, those involving his legs had done the most damage. Surely, said the doctors, Jose would never walk again. After months in the hospital, it seemed they were right. At one point, the once strapping young soccer player was so ill that he weighed less than 100 pounds. But this is the rest of the story. One afternoon, Jose's father brought a wheelchair into the sick room. He intended only to give his son a brief outing, a change of scenery, but the sight of that wheelchair so horrified the young man, the silent suggestion of such a lifetime of confinement, that he vowed that he would never use the wheelchair and that somehow he would regain the use of his legs. His family offered to assist in that challenge any way that they could. If Jose wanted to walk badly enough, they said, then he would indeed. Well, after weeks had passed, the doctors began to agree. It might take a long while, but now there did appear a chance that Jose would eventually recover. And so began years of tedious, often frustrating physical therapy. It was a nurse who first proposed the psychological therapy of music. To Jose, the idea was absurd. During his primary education, he had not even qualified to sing in the children's choir, but the nurse insisted. She even gave Jose an inexpensive guitar. And that's how one young man embarked upon a marvelous, magical learning time 3 decades ago. In the years since, a star was born, with only a background in soccer and in law, the study of which he completed. That is, with no formal musical training at all, Jose practiced and perfected until one day, Newsweek magazine would hail him as the most popular singer in the world. He has sold more than 100 million record albums. That makes him the best-selling musical artist in history. Now, Jose de la Cueva, you would recognize by a middle name. And if you have followed the brilliant singing career of Julio Iglesias since his United States debut in 1983, you may have noticed that he walks with an ever-so-slight limp. Well, now you know the rest of the story. Now, the rest of the story. Everybody in Washington, Missouri knew Happy Hooligan. He was the strange old tramp who lived in a vacant building near St. John's Creek, about 2 miles west of town. Happy's appearance was anything but. His hair and beard were long, scraggly, crudely framed a scowling visage. In winter, he bound his feet with burlap bags to ward off the cold. But gloom and frost seemed to follow him through the summer as well, as though it emanated from some secret place inside him. The dour, dirty little man earned money by making curios from cast-off cigar boxes. The meager profits were consumed by food and liquor, the latter of which eventually consumed him. Happy Hooligan was found dead February 1912. Was buried in an unmarked grave in the town cemetery. It was not until 84 years later, in March of 1996, that the gravesite was identified from a list of burial certificates and a tombstone was placed there. And the reason is the rest of the story. You see, in 1955, 43 years after the death of the bum called Happy Hooligan, a Washington resident named William Wilkie happened across the obituary in a March 1, 1912 copy of the town newspaper, a brief notice which named the man who had found the body and gave results of the county coroner's inquest. It also reported the real name of the deceased, Fritz Franke. Mr. Wilkie, curious, did some digging, and what he discovered painted a poignant portrait. For Fritz Franke, destined for social ostracism and virtual anonymity, had served with distinction as a Union Army officer in the 27th Pennsylvania Regiment during our Civil War, was imprisoned at Andersonville, later became an agent for the Federal Reserve Board, a private businessman, and a journalist. But then in 1895, Fritz Franke lost his wife and 4 youngest children in a diphtheria epidemic. 5 years later, yet another daughter died of scarlet fever. 5 years after that, his son, his last living offspring, died of pneumonia. And it was about that time that Fritz Franke crawled into a bottle and never came out. In no time, he had regressed into a disheveled and apparently illiterate itinerant nicknamed Happy Hooligan. And so the town of Washington, Missouri, Happy Hooligan's last stop on his way to oblivion, reviewing the 41-year-old discoveries of William Wilkie, has finally acknowledged Fritz Franke's place in its history with an appropriately engraved gravestone to mark his final resting place. But now, wait a minute. If you're passing that way to pay your respects, you must know precisely what the marker says, because it does not say Happy Hooligan. It does not say Fritz Franke. Instead, that monument reflects who Fritz Franke really was, how he was known before he came to this country to aid the Union in our Civil War. The gravestone reads, Count von Liechtenstein, Crown Prince of Austria, the man who fell from grace and returned to honor. The prince who became a pauper is now at last a prince again. Now you know the rest of the story.
Radio 710 WOR.
Won't you join me tomorrow morning at 8:30 for our morning get-together, part of Rambling with Gambling on America's information station, WOR, Radio 710. Hello, Americans, I'm Paul Harvey. You know what the news is. In a minute, you're going to hear the rest of the story. Leonard was in the 4th grade when his childhood ended forever. His mother, not long after giving birth to baby George, had fallen ill. Inflammatory rheumatism, they called it, in 1893. Mother Emma would be bedridden and invalid for years at least. Somebody would have to stay home and look after her to do all of the chores that she could no longer do. So her eldest son, John, was already working, and husband Frank, the most popular barber in Colorado Springs, was occupied as such. That left Leonard, age 10. And so it was that the little boy dropped out of school to become nurse and homemaker for his mother and a 4-year-old sister and a newborn brother. That was a tall order in itself, but this is the rest of the story. Leonard's parents were deaf, could not hear. His father from a childhood case of typhoid, his mother from birth. Because she lived in a silent world, being active physically and socially was particularly precious to Emma, and then suddenly immobility, isolation. Emma's main contact with practically everyone and everything else was now through her small son, Leonard. Reared in a household of deaf parents, Leonard already knew sign language, but Emma needed more than communication. She needed signs of life. So 10-year-old Leonard, when he returned home from errands of necessity, would go to his mother's bedside and recreate the world which he had encountered, filling in the awkward spaces with the language of his hands. He would act out the adventures of neighbors and friends, their foibles and toils and triumphs, the myriad threads in the sprawling tapestry of hometown Colorado Springs. Often Emma would laugh. Sometimes she would weep. Always she was compelled by the animated performances of the little boy who had devoted his young life to her welfare. Emma was several years recovering from the ailment that had imprisoned her. By that time, Leonard had grown into a fine young man with a remarkable ability to express himself. Summer months, he worked as a tour guide at Pikes Peak, but the visitors he accompanied burrow-back into the scenic highlands were astonished not only by the boundless vistas, but by Leonard's thrilling, intriguing, inspiring histories of the region, embellished by the marvelous expressions of his face and his graceful hands. Of course, you've learned where he developed those particular skills at the bedside of an invalid, unhearing mother, as her own private storyteller, her interpreter of the sounds of silence. You never knew Frank, the renowned deaf barber of Colorado Springs, Colorado. You never knew his wife, Emma, who in the autumn of 1877 joined him in a life of fathomless quiet. But the world would come to know and much to admire the man their son Leonard became a master of his art, an infinitely expressive and spellbinding spinner of yarns who let you see through his eyes to his heart. Until now, you were acquainted only with the legend of the silent screen, the so-called man of 1,000 faces. But now you've met the boy at Emma's bedside, a fourth-grade dropout who filled the air with sounds that weren't there, a youngster named Leonard Chaney. Lon Chaney? Lon Chaney. Now you know the rest of the story. You know what the news is. In a minute, you're going to hear the rest of the story. The rest of the story. It was a spring exhibition baseball game in Florida's Payne Park, an exhibition game between the Boston Red Sox and the Milwaukee Braves. They used to say that Payne Park was rightly named, at least from a batter's perspective, because it was a big ballpark, a most difficult one in which to home run. Anyway, the Sox and the Braves were going at it that day. Pitching for Boston was a fellow named DeLock, right-hander, nothing spectacular. He did pitch a lot of fastballs. But let's pretend we're watching a movie of the game, and we'll run it fast forward. We'll freeze on one frame. It shows Ike on the mound, the Braves' rookie second baseman at the plate. Now, this second baseman with the bat poised above his shoulder is barely 20. He has been called promising. So have plenty of rookies. Now, on this perfectly ordinary day, in the middle of this perfectly ordinary preseason game, the young second baseman is facing DeLock. Ike winds up, and the pitch, well, it's a screaming fastball. It's Ike's specialty. Now, had that been a curveball or a slider or any other pitch, baseball history might now read differently, but it was a fastball, and the young second baseman uncoiled with a crusher. It's the thing about a fastball, combine the speed of the ball with the speed of the swinging bat, and they connect solidly, and that ball is gone. Well, this ball was gone. The Braves manager, Charlie Grimm, could not get over it. Almost 400 feet to that long left field fence, and yet the rookie second baseman had sent the ball over that fence and into a trailer park beyond. It was only a preseason game, insignificant in most every way, but this is the rest of the story. The Braves manager, Charlie Grimm, had been counting on a recent trade acquisition for his team, a big hitting outfielder named Bobby Thompson. But then right before the opening game of the season, Thompson broke an ankle. That left a gaping hole in left field. There were at least 2 or 3 other players who might have filled that position, but manager Grimm, recalling that one stunning, super long, preseason home run by the young second baseman, chose that young man. And the rookie would always be certain that one home run was the reason he stayed with the Braves. And eventually, that young man was to hit more home runs than anyone else in Major League history. And now I hope you'll remember the day it all began. A March afternoon in 1954, for a rookie who was then faltering as a second baseman, young Hank Aaron. For now you know the rest of the story. You know what the news is. In a minute, you're going to hear the rest of the story. Rest of the story. 12 time zones. Half the entire world separated Captain Luther from his bride Alma and the newborn son that he had never seen. So until the captain was ordered home again, the young couple would have to love each other through letters. Every 2 weeks, a Marine chopper would plunge into the jungle, delivering cigarettes and paperback books and mail. Luther lived for the sight of that helicopter because Alma's latest love letters were always on board. In them, Luther's wife faithfully declared all of the things a young soldier far from home wants to hear, reassurances of her affection and devotion, reports of the health and the happiness of the family. And just as faithfully, Luther wrote back. This Vietnam was a strange and troubled place, he related. But he personally was fine, just fine. He had even taught his new Vietnamese friends some country and western songs. And, oh yes, I love you. And so it went as the months trudged on. Yet neither Luther nor Alma realized the rest of the story. For what the young captain did not say in his letters was that he was almost daily in the line of fire. either encamped with the Kong lobbing mortar shells at him or patrolling the remote mountains and valleys and swamps and jungles where the enemy lay in wait. They ambushed practically every morning before dawn, engaged the patrols in random firefights by day and night. Land mines and booby traps lurked everywhere. And aside from the VC, there were bloodthirsty leeches that dropped from the trees and sword-sharp elephant grass that would slice human flesh, and from moment to moment disease and exhaustion and monotony and terror played tag in the mud and the blood called Southeast Asia. But why worry Alma in his letters, Luther asked himself. For in 1963, most Americans knew nothing about Vietnam beyond what they learned from family or friends in the service. It would be better then, the captain decided, that his bride did not fret over something she could not change. Meanwhile, back in Alma's hometown, Birmingham, Alabama, another kind of war had erupted. The city had seemed quiet enough last time Luther saw it, but now race hate was exploding in Birmingham streets and hearts. Bombs rocked black neighborhoods by the dozens. Demonstrators for and against integration marched by the thousands. In the torrent of confrontations, children were attacked by police dogs and blasted off their feet by high-pressure hoses. Picketers were arrested. Even Martin Luther King was behind bars in Birmingham. And yet, even though newlywed Alma lived in the midst of it, the war front that her home front had become went unreported in her letters to her husband Luther. Insulated by his own circumstances, he knew nothing of Birmingham's civil strife. Nor, without Alma telling him, could he have known that drive-by shooters had fired at next-door neighbors while his young wife hung diapers on the clothesline. And thus did simultaneous wars pass for a young couple 3 decades ago, with each protecting the other from unalterable anguish. They remained an unusually close couple, as they do to this day. All who know them say. And with this glimpse of their regard for each other, one can imagine why love endures. For two lovers who in hell spoke only of heaven, and who cling to each other even yet. Alma Johnson and the young captain who became retired General Luther Powell. Now you know the rest of the story.
Radio 710 WWII.
Won't you join me tomorrow morning at 8:30 for our morning get-together? Part of Rambling with Gambling on America's information station, WOR. Hello, Americans. I'm Paul Harvey. You know what the news is. In a minute, you're going to hear the rest of the story. Now, the rest of the story. A.S. Nico, N-I-C-O, was his name. He was General Superintendent for the Genesee Pure Food Company. The company's cornerstone product was a drink made of burned sugar and roasted rye grain, very popular in its day, and Mr. Nico was the plant superintendent. Now, one morning he and his employer, Francis Woodward, were touring the facility. Mr. Woodward, by the way, was also founder of Genesee Pure Foods. They were strolling the plant, they came to the storage area, and they stopped. In momentary silence, Mr. Woodward gazed at that mountainous pile of food cases, cartons containing a certain food product which Genesee had been trying to market for years, utterly unsuccessfully. Mr. Woodward then turned to his employee, Mr. Nico, and he said, I have a proposition for you. I'll give you everything that's in those cartons and all of the rights to the recipe for $35. The superintendent replied, No. I think first you should hear the rest of the story. That food product Mr. Woodward could not sell, had not been selling for more than half a century. It was originally concocted in 1845 by a man named Peter Cooper, philanthropist, inventor of the famous Tom Thumb locomotive. Cooper even took out a patent on the formula, but nobody wanted it. And then in 1895, a New York cough medicine manufacturer named P.B. Waite went into the packaged food business. 2 years later, he added the Cooper concoction to his line of products, but Mr. Waite had no better luck in marketing that than had its inventor. So he, Mr. Waite, sold the product to his neighbor, Francis Woodward, the founder of the Genesee Pure Food Company, sold the whole thing, rights and recipe, for $450, but Mr. Woodward could not sell it. So one day, as he's touring his plant with his general superintendent, Mr. Nico, he happened across the unopened, unsold, unwanted packing boxes full of Cooper concoction, and the stuff that had refused to sell, and he turned to the superintendent and he offered to sell him that product and the recipe, all of it, for $35. Well, that's almost 100 years ago. Today, that product is cherished among America's favorite foods. It has been enormously popular as such since the turn of the 20th century. But now you know that once upon a time, it was a total flop. And for more than 5 decades, it was a total flop and practically given away by Francis Woodward to an employee, A.S. Nico. Now, P.S., nobody remembers what the initials A.S. stand for. Nobody recalls as much as Mr. Nico's first name. And the reason history has relegated him to the annals of the semi-anonymous is because his employer, Mr. Woodward, ended up keeping the product, and later he did market it, and successfully. And today the entire world knows Cooper's concoction by the name of Jell-O. And you've never heard of the fellow named Nico. And probably you'll never hear of him again, because when his boss offered him the rights to what would become one of the most consumed foods of the century, when he offered him the recipe and the rights and the patent for $35, the employee, Mr. Nico, turned him down. And now you know the rest of the story.
Radio 710 WOR.
Won't you join me tomorrow morning at 8:30 for our morning get-together? Part of Rambling with Gambling on America's information station, Radio 710 WOR. You know what the news is. In a minute, you're going to hear the rest of the story. The rest of the story. Bob was a gentle man, utterly soft-hearted, especially when it came to animals. Hear about the day that he found this black and tan terrier swimming out in New York Bay, little dog paddling for her life, and Bob pulled her out of the water, of course, and dried her off. Never did figure out where she'd come from. Had fallen from a passing ship, perhaps. Anyway, Bob took her home and named her Dart. Dart's ears and tail had been cropped by a previous owner, and that really made Bob angry. Needlessly cruel, he called it. So when he learned Dart was pregnant, he vowed that none of her puppies would be subjected to such a thing, and they were not. Oh, Bob kept them, naturally. In fact, he had quite a few pets, a number of cats and kittens. Wonderful company, he called them. Several chickens, whose comfort he was constantly attending to. In fact, there was a favorite hen, came and went as she pleased. And one day she did not return on schedule, and Bob searched for hours until she was found. And a rattlesnake. That's right, Bob even had a pet rattlesnake once. He was quite unhappy when it died one night. Bob had a particular weakness for birds. He seemed to have a talent for spotting baby birds in distress, and he was always tending them or returning them to their nests. And then, of course, there were Bob's horses and donkeys and ponies. Transporting those from place to place always caused him a great deal of anxiety. The handlers were never gentle enough, he often complained. For Bob's heart was a soft heart. He was an admirer of sunsets and a stroller of flower gardens and a planter of trees and a lover of animals. And this, remember, was in a day when men were chided for being less than macho, when men were chided for these inclinations. So Bob was a long time ahead of his time. He was an opponent of cosmetic surgery for dogs, simply to satisfy the egos of their owners. He was an advocate of the humane treatment of horses, and this was during an era when horses were treated as things, and often horses were worked or overworked, ridden till they had dropped dead. Much of the time, Bob was so conscientiously looking after his pets, even though there was a war going on all around him. You remember the pet hen that didn't return when she was supposed to? Bob launched a full-scale search for her right in the middle of one of the biggest battles of his life. In the middle of a war, he's out there searching for this pet hen. Bob even stopped one day to put a baby bird back in its nest while his army was under heavy fire in the middle of another battle. And couriers who sometimes rode their horses too hard were invariably reprimanded by Bob. And he said it didn't make any difference how important the message was. They were never, ever to ride a horse into the ground. You know this man I'm talking about. You've known him most of your life. I expect that you may have pictured him otherwise than as a humanitarian. But I hope now and henceforth you will always envision this man, when you hear his name, embracing a soaking wet black and tan terrier or cradling a baby bird in the hollow of his hands. Whenever you think of the soft heart inside the Iron General called Robert E. Lee, you will know the rest of the story.
That's the
Rest of the story. The story. His name was Stanley Frank, but in the summer of 1940, he got a new nickname, Dead Arm. He was playing minor league baseball in Florida for a club called the Daytona Beach Islanders, and he was really a good pitcher. But they had him in center field that night, and that was an unfortunate decision because there was this fly ball almost out of his range, but he ran for it, and he stretched out that glove, and he caught the ball just barely, but he paid for the catch. He fell hard on his left shoulder, his pitching shoulder. The doctor looked at it right away. It was a bad bruise, he said. For most folks, nothing to worry about, but for a pitcher, it could be the end. Well, Dead Arm pitched 2 more times after that. He went up against Sanford and won. So the doctor appeared to have been wrong after all. But then came that second game against Orlando. The batters killed him. Homers, right and left, and worst of all, that left shoulder was in such pain now. Such pain as he had never experienced before. So the manager called him in the next day and he said, "How are you feeling?" And Dead Arm looked down at his shoes and he said, "I think I'd better quit." He said, "I'm not making much money anyway, and Lillian is expecting a baby. I think I'd better quit." And the manager added, "You certainly can't pitch." And Dead Arm nodded. He had been training all of his young life to pitch in the majors. Back in high school, he had refused to play football, unwilling to risk an injury to his pitching arm. When his father had insisted on college, the boy argued him out of that and went straight into the minors. Now it was all for nothing. No way that his arm was going to heal good enough to get him onto a major league pitcher's mound. He repeated to Daytona manager Dickie Kerr, quote, "I guess I'd better quit." But Mr. Kerr said, "You can't." Dead Arm was amazed at that response. How was he supposed to keep playing baseball? But Dickie Kerr said there was one way. Get real good at something besides pitching. That's all you have to do. Get good at something like hitting. Dead Arm did. I mean, he got good at hitting. I mean, he concentrated and worked as he never imagined that he could, and from a modest batting average of .258, the young ball player that no team wanted in 1941 rose to .379 that same year in Class C Western Association ball. But wait a minute. Again that same season, when the Cardinals called him aboard in the middle of their pennant race, Dead Arm batted .426 in a dozen games with 7 RBIs. And he went on to win 7 National League batting titles. For the young man whose career as a pitcher ended all at once, August 11, 1940, took an unexpected path to the big leagues and ultimately to baseball immortality. For you will recognize Dead Arm when I mention his full name, Stanley Frank Musial. That's right, Stan the Man Musial. And now you know the rest of the story.
Radio 710 WOR.
Hello, Americans. I'm Paul Harvey. You know what the news is. In a minute, you're going to hear the rest of the story. The Johns Hopkins Medical Letter is offering a new understanding of an old ailment, heartburn. In short-sleeve English, heartburn is a burning in your chest after meals when your powerful digestive juices back up on you. Reading further, the Johns Hopkins Medical Letter notes that something called Pepsid AC is now available without prescription. Pepsid AC can stop heartburn before or after it starts and control acid all through the night. Now we can enjoy wonder meals if we take Pepsid AC. This is not one of those antacids which just promise to relieve heartburn. Pepsid AC relieves and prevents heartburn and acid indigestion and sour stomach. And isn't it nice to know that these respected physicians are recommending a remedy which does not even require a prescription? Pepsid AC at any drugstore. Hampton Academy near Herman, Maine. He and his wife and their newborn daughter live in a double-wide mobile home which they rent. Wife Tabitha, although a college graduate, feels fortunate in the current economy to have found work as a waitress at a Dunkin' Donuts in Bangor. You see, Steve's $6,000 a year salary doesn't pay for much. And together, Steve and Tabitha can't even afford to repair their 7-year-old car, which barely runs, or to keep their telephone, which the phone company has recently removed. And, oh yes, Steve has started drinking. And you can now imagine why, but you really ought to hear the rest of the story. As long as he was stuck with an English teacher's salary, Steve figured he might as well permit himself an English teacher's dream, to publish a novel, to become rich and famous thereby. And he more than dreamed. He tried. I mean, Steve, on a teacher's schedule, which demands evenings and weekends for grading papers and planning lessons, somehow found the time to write an entire book, sitting up late every night, plunking away on his wife's tiny portable typewriter, which he'd placed in a tiny table in the trailer's tiny furnace room. Steve wrote what he believed was the great American novel. He called it Blaze. The publisher to whom he sent it called it boring, and back it came. All right, it was a misfire, Steve told himself. Blaze was just a requisite warm-up for the real thing. The next great American novel he clacked out in the furnace room, he entitled Getting It On. What a title, Steve thought. What a book. The publisher's reply was, please stop bothering us. But Steve, undeterred, continued to write. And his third novel, The Running Man, was different, if only because of its sad similarities to Steve's own life. For in The Running Man, the hero is a fellow who finds himself unable to provide for his wife and his child, and so he takes a terrible risk. He becomes a contestant on a game show that'll either win him a fortune or kill him. Well, the ring of symbolic truth notwithstanding, The Running Man was rejected by Doubleday, and it was rejected by Ace Books, and that did it. Steve tossed the novel in a drawer and poured himself a scotch. As for the book, it stayed in the drawer for almost a decade. As for Steve, he was finally forced to face the facts. He was a low-paid teacher whose family was probably destined to starve. He was never going to write the great American novel. He may never write anything ever again. But then, not even Steve could have guessed how very stubborn and stupid that he would turn out to be, stubborn and stupid enough to try yet again the following year a fourth novel, this one called Carrie. And Carrie was the first in a long succession of successful horror stories, stories that would transform a struggling English teacher into the world's richest and most famous author of scary fiction, Stephen King. Now you know the rest of the story.
Radio 710 WOR.
Won't you join me tomorrow morning at 8:30 for a morning get-together, part of Rambling with Gambling on America's information station, Radio 710 WOR. You know what the news is. In a minute, you're going to hear the rest of the story. Airman Jim Smith just stood there blinking when the orders came down. He and most of the B-29 personnel at the 315th Bomb Wing had been celebrating the night before. Their conditions ranged from hungover to half-conscious. The last thing on their minds was a mission. Yet here they were, more or less at attention, awaiting the latest directive from upstairs. Army Air Force intelligence had come to a conclusion. The Japanese were so short on petroleum that a strike on their Nippon oil refineries at Akita would finish them off. So the 315th, almost 150 B-29s were being sent on the mission that afternoon. Jim Smith, radio operator of the B-29 called the Boomerang, did some fast figuring in his head. The 315th was stationed on Guam. The Akita oil fields were nearly 300 miles northwest of Tokyo. That would make the strike about 4,000 miles round trip, pushing some 20 hours in the air. Easily the longest and perhaps the most dangerous B-29 mission from the Marianas of the entire war. Aching and groggy, the crewmen clambered aboard their aircraft and headed straight for the oxygen bottles. At 16:42 hours, the first B-29 left base. As the day became night, Jim Smith looked around him, the sky swarming with flying fortresses in the dying light. Even under normal conditions, you could expect plenty of hot engine fires and explosions on the big birds, and for this mission, to make room for the requisite gasoline and bombs, all of the armament had been stripped away. All of the armor was gone, except for 2 repeaters and a cannon in the tail. And because they would be operating under cover of night, there could be no fighter escort, so the more Jim thought, the more he wondered, could the Boomerang, a veteran of 8 missions, could it possibly come back one more time? Well, this is the rest of the story. The mission was a success, and in more ways than one. First, in a single airstrike, 67% of Japan's inner zone oil went up in smoke. Second, and quite by coincidence, the raid triggered a blackout, and the blackout thwarted a Japanese military coup, including a plot to kidnap Emperor Hirohito. For if the conspirators had succeeded in their revolt, the war would have been prolonged, and an Allied land invasion of Japan would have proved inevitable, despite the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Did I mention the Boomerang returned safely, along with the rest of the 315th Bomb Wing, on the morning of August 15, 1945? That was 9 days after Harry Truman sent Hiroshima to hell. Yet it took more than nuclear warfare to bring the Japanese to their knees. In fact, the Boomerang was still in the air, returning to base when Japan's official surrender was announced. The history books have it wrong, you see. Even the airmen of the 315th Bomb Wing were celebrating the setting of the rising sun when they got the orders to bomb Akita. Not even they realized that they would carry out the final mission of World War II. You've always heard it was the flight of the Enola Gay. But now you will always remember the day the Boomerang came back. Because now you know the rest of the story. Hello, Americans, I'm Paul Harvey. You know what the news is. In a minute, you're going to hear the rest of the story. Hay fever or allergy to certain pollens in the air can be eased or prevented with a specific formula of supplemental vitamins. And now you can get all of those vitamins in a single tablet called Allergy 10 from High Health. Allergy 10, the simplest solution yet to allergy sufferers. Summertime should be fun time. Don't let the sniffles spoil the fun. It can be prevented with Allergy 10 from High Health. To place an order, telephone 1-800-686-2299. That free 800 number is 686-2299. Now, the rest of the story. Clara and Al were in love. They wanted to get married. Idyllic so far, except that Clara and Al were blood-related. Considering the strength of their affection, and under most circumstances, a matter of little significance. But Clara and Al were also Catholic. If they were to be properly married in the eyes of God and the church, permission would be necessary. An official bending of the law. A special dispensation from Rome. Well, you will hear the case for their marriage as it was presented to the papal court, and then the rest of the story. Al was 47, a government worker, married, 2 children. Dashing fellow in those days, solidly built, blue-eyed, sweeping-handle mustache, thick, dark brown hair. His wife, Fran, was near death, tuberculosis. To care for his ailing wife and his youngsters, Al sought the assistance of Clara. Clara was slender, tall, 24, quiet, pleasant young woman. Helping Al was only natural in that she was a blood relative. One summer evening, Al's wife passed away. So now Al is alone in charge of 2 small children. His affection for Clara increased, as did hers for him. Al proposed, Clara accepted, but there's this complication. Since they were related and since they were Catholic, their union would require permission from the church. In a letter to their bishop, Clara and Al wrote, quote, "Those who with most humble devotion have appended their signatures below have decided upon marriage, but according to the enclosed family tree they are prevented by canonical impediment. They therefore make the humble request that the most reverend episcopate will graciously secure for them a dispensation on the following grounds. The intended bridegroom has been a widower since August 10. He's the father of 2 minors. They both need the services of a nurse, all the more because the father's a customs official away from home all day and often at night, therefore in no position to supervise the education and upbringing of his children. The intended bride has been caring for these children ever since their mother's death. They are very fond of her, and thus it may be justifiably assumed that they will be well brought up and that the marriage will be a happy one. Well, the bishop read the letters sympathetically, but felt that he could not grant the dispensation. It was suggested that Al obtain a certificate of poverty in order to avoid the high cost of proceeding further, and then have the plea translated into Latin and sent to Rome. And this was done. And there, the petition of Clara and Al rested before the papal court. If only for this next minute, you are Pope Leo the 13th. You understand the precepts of tempering justice with mercy. You know that bending the law is sometimes of divine inspiration. But is this the time? You know the facts. Though in the shoes of the fisherman, what would you do? Well, now let's compare your choice with his. This is what really happened. In 3 weeks, a special dispensation was granted to Clara and Al. In 2 months, the happy couple married. In 4 more years, to the customs official and his young wife, a child was born. A boy child. Adolf Hitler. Now you know the rest of the story. Hello, Americans. I'm Paul Harvey. You know what the news is. In a minute, you're going to hear the rest of the story. There is now food for your eyes. The Journal of the American Medical Association has recognized that macular degeneration, which can cause blindness, may instead improve with proper nutrition. And High Health has assembled all of the recommended vitamins in a single capsule called Eye Nutrition Formula. It includes lutein, which the respected AMA Journal agrees is a factor in fighting off macular degeneration. It is an exciting advance in nutrition for the eyes, and you can order the High Health Eye Nutrition Formula with a phone call to 1-800-686-2299. That free 800 number is 686-2299. Now, the rest of the story. Storm clouds were gathering over dairy country. The farmer looked up fretfully into the glowering sky, then out over his herd. They seemed to know, he thought, as they ambled restlessly down the slope. But not even the farmer himself could have imagined the kind of weather approaching. The first drops of rain fell heavily, as though they were larger somehow, or perhaps falling faster than they ordinarily did. They stung the farmer's face as he gazed upward again, trying to read the danger looming over him. The adjoining property was going to be hit hard, low-lying as it was, and the neighbor farmer was well aware of it. At that moment, he was frantically attempting to herd his animals to shelter and safety. The last of them were still lingering in the dry gorge below the pasture when the first clap of thunder rang out. Their owner looked down, watching as the ravine swelled with rain and the stream became a torrent. The animals would drown if he didn't go down there and lead them out. He had raised most of them from birth. He would not give up easily. And yet another neighbor farmer was milking his herd when the deluge began. Now the nervous animals shifted and kicked as they stood in their stalls. The wind was howling now, whipping the trees like grass blades in a breeze. At some point, the farmer must have realized that several young animals, the spring crop, were still afield, because he suddenly bolted from his chores and headed out into the sideways rain. Well, after the storm had passed, the real work began. Counting the herd, cleaning the animals, chasing off the predators, flushed out from the lowland floods. Some of the herds would have to be moved to safer grazing land, at least until the mush was firm underfoot once more, and the visage of nature was smiling again. All that you have just heard, an anxious afternoon in a community of dairy farmers, happens innumerable times every year, all over the world, in similar communities. Yet these farmers although they live and labor and tend their herds and watch over their pastures on every continent except Antarctica, are all but completely ignored by their neighbors of other species. That's right, I said their neighbors of other species. For the dairymen who raise and groom and protect and milk and manage their herds and do so in an orderly, conscientious fashion are not herding cattle at all. What they are herding are tiny insects, aphids and scale bugs and other plant lice. You see, nature's forgotten dairy farmer, the organized producer and storer and consumer of an insect milk called honeydew, gently herding and milking his aphids with his antenna, is the ubiquitous herder ant. The herder ant. I know, sometimes it's tempting to imagine that we humans are unique in our complex and regimented and sophisticated ways, but now you know we're not all that unique. Because now you know the rest of the story. Won't you join me tomorrow morning at 8:30 for a morning get-together, part of Rambling with Gambling on America's information station, WOR Radio 710. Hello, Americans. I'm Paul Harvey. You know what the news is. In a minute, you're going to hear the rest of the story. I'm betting you've never had such a fast shave as with the Wall, W-A-H-L. I'm always shaved in less than 1 minute, and that includes cleaning the razor. None of that circling round and round, which other electrics require. And the Wall shaver comes with 3 separate cutting heads, so there is one that's just right for any beard of any texture. Look, try one for 30 days on me, and if you're not convinced that Wall has it all, send it back for a full refund. You can get them at Sears, you can get them at Service Merchandise. To locate other dealers, telephone 1-800-48-SHAVE. 1-800-48-SHAVE. Now, the rest of the story. Edmund Ruffin gently patted the loaded pistol lying in his lap. It was not the beloved firearm upon which he meditated, for as he sat there staring into the invisible distance, he beheld the procession of yesterdays that had brought him to this terrible today. A prosperous Virginia planter and journalist before the nation tore itself asunder, Edmund Ruffin had distinguished himself as the leading Southern agriculturist of his time. He was president of the Virginia State Agricultural Society. He published a popular periodical called the Farmer's Register, which advanced his latest theories and elaborated on his methods. He also authored a book describing his revolutionary new system of crop rotation and fertilization, a text that would set new standards in agriculture. But then as differences north and south deepened, Ruffin's attention turned to politics. A passionate proponent of Southern nationalism, he traveled to several Southern states urging secession with the same zeal that he had once promoted scientific farming. He wrote a number of articles defending slavery. He made certain that he was present at John Brown's hanging. He attended 3 state secession conventions. And when Virginia at first refused to abandon the Union, Edmund Ruffin abandoned Virginia and went to live in South Carolina. It was there that this revered veteran of the War of 1812 got the thrill and the honor of his life. He was permitted, as a member of the Palmetto Guards of Charleston, from a battery emplacement on Cummings Point at the tip of Morris Island, he was permitted to fire the first shot at Fort Sumter. That's right, the first shot of the American war between the states. He would follow the Palmetto Guards to the first Battle of Bull Run as well. He was even said to have fired the famed artillery round that blocked the Cub Run Bridge, but Edmund Ruffin, nearly 70 now, would later be persuaded by his superior officers to serve the Confederacy behind the front lines, so he returned to Virginia, and with all of the might that his words could muster, he did. General Lee's eventual surrender was the greatest disappointment of Edmund Ruffin's life. The second greatest disappointment was that the federal authorities not only refused to arrest him after the South fell, they ignored him completely. And so in the waning spring of 1865, in his home in Redmore Plantation, Amelia County, Virginia, the defeated and despondent Confederate firebrand Edmund Ruffin picked up the revolver from his lap and put its muzzle to his head, and with a tiny twitch of his finger, obliterated his humiliation forever. For Edmund Ruffin was more than a surrendered soldier in gray. He was the human symbol of an entire system that committed suicide, a way of life which, for the evil at its core, had to die. But Edmund Ruffin's legacy included a significant something else for which he is remembered here, the bookends that enclose the annals of the most disgraceful era in United States history. For you see, at Cummings Point, he fired the shot that ushered that era in. And whether in his final moments it occurred to him or not, at Redmore, he fired the shot that ushered that era out. He fired the first shot, and he fired the last shot of our uncivil war. Now you know the rest of the story. Warren's friends and co-workers always knew that he'd wind up, as they put it, in the nut house. Well, he had had a nervous breakdown, all right, but the sanitarium in which he found himself was scarcely an insane asylum. It was more a health spa, actually. A popular facility run by the innovative and slightly controversial Dr. John. And still the doctor had assured Warren's worried family that his sanitarium was indeed the ideal place for the young man to recover. And so 5 days after his 24th birthday, at the urging of his father, Warren checked himself into Dr. John's sanitarium. Well, the new patient's introductory interview quickly revealed the rest of the story. He was a newspaper man, first of all, and that's enough to drive anyone to distraction. And his newspaper, The Star, had proved a formidable challenge from the day he had become its editor and part owner in the town of Marion, Ohio. Warren personally researched and wrote all of the local news. He also solicited and wrote the paper's advertisements. He even helped set the type and round up the delivery boys, and all of this each and every day. Warren, tormented and exhausted himself in the promotion of his publication, made sure that the names of every man, woman, and child in town would appear in the Star at least once a year. And to achieve his goals for the paper, he slept in his office, ignored his personal needs, published so close to the edge that he often wrote news stories straight into the print case. The only time the Star ever came close to missing a deadline was when Warren attempted to mend his only pair of trousers, so he promptly went back to neglecting himself for the good of the paper, he said. To shed stress, he chewed tobacco so furiously that he had to keep a brass cuspidor at his desk, and thus, with Warren at the helm, did the Star sail bravely through the Depression times and all that political turmoil and all the legal difficulties. But his newspaper's success carried a big price tag, an unaffordable one. For one day the journalist who did everything suddenly could do nothing, found himself staring into space or weeping for no apparent reason. And it was in this useless condition that Warren arrived at Dr. John's sanitarium. Friends in Marion, Ohio, expected never to see him again, at least not the vigorous, ambitious young man they had known. But the folks back home had underestimated the stuff of which he was made and the skill of the physician in whose care he had been entrusted. For after only a few weeks traveling Dr. John's personally prescribed road to health, Warren returned home with a rosy complexion, 20 pounds lighter and raring to go. The Marion newspaper man was to visit Dr. John's sanitarium for recovery and refreshment 4 more times over the next dozen years, and each time, sure enough, he returned in better shape than the time before. Had these two men never met in the autumn of 1889, there's no telling what might have become of the overworked, overwrought journalist who slept in his office and set his own type, a determined but self-destructive newspaper man who instead went on to become President of the United States, Warren G. Harding. But all the rest of his life, President Harding knew in his heart the profound significance of his cure in the care of Dr. John Kellogg, the Battle Creek, Michigan physician who put the nation's future chief executive back in business by feeding him a personally concocted something called corn flakes. And now you know the rest of the story.
WWII.
you join me tomorrow morning at 8:30 for a morning get-together? Part of Rambling with Gambling on America's information station, WOR Radio 710. Hello, Americans. I'm Paul Harvey. You know what the news is. In a minute, you're going to hear the rest of the story. Mary Manning of Loveland, Colorado is 83, but she's a lady on the go, and the only way she goes is on a three-wheel bicycle. And one morning, just weeks before last Christmas, she was in church when somebody made off with her bicycle. Well, Mary knew what to do. She called Steve Bateman, her Allstate agent, who ordered a replacement bike assembled and delivered to Mary's door just in time to give Mary a high-riding Merry Christmas. So any time of year, being in good hands is the only place to be. And you are in good hands with Allstate. Now, the rest of the story. In this particularly hot sweatshop, there was one particularly cold place. Little Jane was 4 years young, only one among dozens of children laboring there. And she feared that cold place more than anything else in the world. What was in the box? Well, it was a huge black box, a cube with 6-foot sides, mounted on large rubber-tired wheels. There was only one way in or out of the black box, a heavy, soundproof door with a lock on it, the key to which was kept in the possession of the sweatshop taskmaster. There was a solitary window also. It was small, made of thick glass. It could not be opened and was covered by an opaque curtain from the outside. The other children had told little Jane in fearful tones what was inside that black box. Nothing. No hint of the world beyond its walls, only pitch dark and horrible silence. Quite in fact, there was something inside that ominous enclosure, an immense block of ice. It served two purposes: to cool what little air there was in the box's unventilated interior, and to intensify its prisoner's punishment. The latter, in effect, was diabolical. For only three options confronted the unfortunate child who found himself or herself thus imprisoned for long hours at a time: to stand alone in the dark, or to lie down in the cold, ever-expanding puddle produced by the melting ice, or to sit on the ice block itself. In any case, the result was always torture and often illness. And what earned a child such a terrifying sentence? Very little, indeed. A minor misbehavior, an inexact execution of an instruction, practically anything less than perfection. Of course, sweatshop employers continually threatened that telling any outsider about the black box was the surest way to get put back in. So the children's parents, who were not permitted on the work site, were also kept in the dark. It was only a matter of time, the other children warned little Jane, before she would be incarcerated in that cold, quiet, intolerable prison. And one day, she was. The experience was every bit as awful as she had been told to anticipate. As was the next time she was locked inside, and the next time, and the next, and after several such punishments, she emerged shivering with a serious ear infection. Little Jane even risked more of the same by eventually confiding in her mother. But the latter, unable even to imagine such cruelty, cast the story aside as the flagrant invention of her precocious young daughter. And yet once upon an unreported crime, there was an industry that put 4-year-olds to work for long hours and low pay and under unforgivable conditions, a sweatshop whose operators even managed artfully and routinely to keep child welfare workers at bay. And you, sitting there in the dark looking up at the big silver screen, you never learned about the secret abuses behind those shining performances. You never saw the fear behind the gunpoint smiles of child actors in the 1930s. Child actors like Jane, Shirley Jane Temple, Shirley Temple, Shirley Temple. Now you know the rest of the story.
Radio 710 WWII.
Won't you join me tomorrow morning at 8:30 for a morning get-together? Part of Rambling with Gambling on America's information station, Radio 710 WOR. Hello, Americans. I'm Paul Harvey. You know what the news is. In a minute, you're going to hear The rest of the story. Well, now there is food for your bones. Teeth and bones are mostly calcium, you know. But you can keep teeth and bones strong just by taking 2 calcium pills every day. Plain calcium won't do. Your body will continue over time to consume its own bones until they become brittle and may break. But the good news is that there is a way to take calcium so that it will be absorbed. It's called Citrical. And you can get it at any drugstore. You don't even need a prescription. Now there is food for your bones. And no age is too early for women to start. Citrical. Now, the rest of the story.